Hey, everybody, I'm Reverend Dan. We are Soul Evolution Collaborative, and this is Stripped Down Sunday, where we get to offer you a little bit of inspiration in a very stripped down fashion. Just the talk, real direct, right into the message, right? So, that said, two quick things. Soul Evolution Collaborative is a bricks and clicks spiritual community, so you can join online and or in person, whatever works for you. Everything you'd want to know about us is at soulevolutioncollaborative.org. If you haven't already been there, pop it open in another tab, check it out. Second, this month is reimagining abundance, and so topics that would normally be prosperity, where we are reimagining what it is like to be abundant. And so this organization and organizations like it are all made possible by donations. Nonprofits are run through donations. And so if this is a community that supports you, if you are moved by this message or any of the other offerings of Soul Evolution Collaborative, feel free to give if it feels good. And I think that's what I'm coming to. It's not that all of this is about donations, not that all of the conversation about abundance is about donations. I think it certainly feels in the past like maybe it has been, and we're trying to shift away from that. So if it feels good, if this serves you, feel free to give. That's how we operate and keep this going. So, all right, let's jump in. So this month is Nacho Mama's Prosperity, Reimagining Abundance, and today is making sense of it all, or at least trying to make sense of it all. Oh, that's fun. I have the green screen is reflecting off my forehead. There we go. All right. So yeah, we at the Soul Evolution Collaborative have, I think, individually and collectively spent years trying to make sense of the details of new thought concept. I mean, anyone who gets involved in any way in new thought concepts, I think, is trying to make sense and relearn about the world, because there's a tendency for new thought principles, universal principles, to kind of flip how we see things in this world. And so definitely no difference when it comes to prosperity and the prosperity teachings that I'll speak for myself. I think this is probably true for us here, your leaders at Soul Evolution Collaborative. But for myself, the prosperity that I was taught was very it was hammered into us that, the universal principles work through prosperity. And so think new thoughts, have new experience, think new prosperous thoughts, and money will show up. And just like everything else, I mean, even the word oneness, I have spent years, reassessing and reassessing, like, what is it really like? Like oneness, that's such a great concept that we're all one. And like, it feels good. It feels really good we're all one. What does it actually mean? What does it actually mean for us to all be one? And when you really get into it, I mean, I have found more and more every time I get into the details of this word, it makes more and more sense. Like, we're actually way more one than I had even thought before, right? I mean, getting down into like, we're literally all made up of the same material, and the singular, what I refer to as the singular thought that created all of this, right? Before there was time and space, there was whatever we want to call it. There was a thought being had. Well, that thought is still being had, and it is outplaying as this whole experience. Oh, so we're literally the effect of that thought, and we're also cause in and of itself. Then we are that thought feeding back to itself and experiencing and being and feeling this whole thing that we call life. And so, we really are one. And like, almost in any way that you could kind of cut that idea up, break that idea down, get into the details of that idea, you will find we are one. We are literally like one with all of it, and looking back over the last few months, I think we've seen a deepening of even how that gets explained, and how how we understand the concepts. And I think that's going to be a big part this month too, is the understandability of what it is we're even talking about. How does it actually apply to life? And so same thing with all these other, kind of buzzwords and the jargon of consciousness and wholeness and energy and vibration and all that stuff, like digging into all those things. And so I think prosperity is one of those words. What is it about prosperity? How can we break this down? What does it really mean? And so kind of making sense of it all is really the theme for this month, right? Like reimagining just like we have reimagined oneness and got a deeper understanding of oneness. What does it mean to reimagine finances? And I have found personally, this may not be true for anyone else, my experience with prosperity feels like taking universal principle and trying to cram it down into this very humanized box of an explanation, into a very humanistic system. And honestly, that might just be because my experience of it has been X, Y, and Z. That's how it makes sense. Whatever the experience of it, it feels restricting. It feels like giving power away to the money, which to me feels very different than how we look at all of our other universal principles. If it's a universal principle, it's true regardless. It's not dependent on our understanding of it. The principle itself is true. So abundance is true. Abundance is the activity of life being. Prosperity, and this might just be individual definitions. And so how do we define the word prosperity? Prosperity, from my experience, feels constricting and small, whereas abundance feels expansive, feels like moving, it feels like energy, it feels like the reciprocal nature, it feels like all of these things that aren't based on the system that we as people have developed. And so one of the fascinating things about prosperity is, so there's all these like prosperity classes and stuff, and they can be great, they can be really effective, they can also not be effective. But one of the things I have found pretty universally true is when you're in one of these prosperity classes, and I've done many over the years, unexpected income tends to show up. And that's kind of like the focus of a lot of these classes, is like start shifting your consciousness. What are your beliefs about money? And so much of that work has been really helpful. And yet I think for most of us, the idea of taking a prosperity class is because we're looking to have a greater experience of financial flow, right? And so while I'm in the class, there's this expanse. When the class ends, it's like, so does that expansion. Wow, what the heck is that about? And that feels so different than years ago, taking the first foundations class, right? The first class of Science of Mind, New Thought Principles. And leaving that class, it felt like it continued to expand, and getting into the next class, and there was just this continual expansion. Again, this is literally just my experience, my story of this. This might not at all be true for you. And yet I suspect that this is probably not an uncommon experience, that coming out of a prosperity class, I remember the first time I had this expectation that the expansion that was experienced in class would just, bloom out in every direction beyond, and it didn't. And it was like, oh, and so this right here is really why I'm saying all this, because the way the teaching is understood becomes really important. Not what we as people within the teaching think about it, not what we as teachers teach about it, but the way that it is understood. And I have seen over and over, and not even just in prosperity, but all over the place, an understanding of the teaching that perpetuates a victim blaming methodology or perspective or ideology, that, well, if you stop the class and you're experiencing a less than perspective or a less than experience of the abundance, then somehow you're doing it wrong, which is something we've kind of been finding. I don't want to say true, but not uncommon throughout how the teaching tends to be viewed, or maybe taught, maybe both, right? Like, do this and you'll have this. But if you don't have this, even if you think you did this and this, then you are the one doing it wrong, right? And I think that's kind of just the how do I say this? So an example of this in health, with our physical health, right? Your out picturing is a mirror of your beliefs, which is true. And yet never are we to be blamed for any physical, mental, whatever less than experience. So if we're living through an experience of some sort of health, illness, disease, whatever, it easily sounds like the understanding of the teaching can easily be, oh, I did something wrong. I am to blame for having this. I didn't think the right things. And so now I have this experience. Wouldn't help anybody. Doesn't help anybody at all ever to be in that place, or to be insinuated to even think that way, or at times to be told that. And so there's potential for great disservice in this misunderstanding. And I think that is the premise of this month, that there is a great misunderstanding about how the principles play out through abundance. And so we are making the move from the terminology around prosperity, especially any prosperity tied to prosperity gospel teachings, stepping into the idea of abundance, because I think it just creates a clean slate, because we here haven't talked about finances from the perspective of abundance nearly as much as we have experienced the teachings of prosperity and how they play out through New Thought principles. So just like with our physical health, I would imagine no one has ever thought, wow, I would really like to have such and such illness or disease or less than health experience. Maybe there has, but no one is out there choosing cancer. No one is out there choosing diabetes, whatever it is, whatever the thing is. No one is out there going, yeah, that one, I want that one, right? No. And yet it exists. It exists because we have it in our collective subconscious. We hold on to this idea of disease and illness. And might it be possible to completely remove all of that from our collective conscious? Yeah, it would probably take a lot of work. It would take all of us, right? But what happens is, anytime that any one of us is not conscious of the thoughts or decisions we're making, the default answer creeps in. And the default answer, in a lot of times, especially around health and things like that, is these major illnesses, even a cold, right? Like, could it be possible to hold one's thoughts in such awareness that we don't get a cold ever? Maybe, probably. I mean, it's possible, right? Would we be allowed to take the time to think about anything else if we were to vary from that very focused thought on health, and to take time to think about anything else? Does that create room for default thinking to step in, even if it's just a moment? Perhaps, I mean, I think everybody gets a cold at some point, and maybe we've worked hard for a period of time and we're tired. And so our focus, I mean, like, I think there's this misunderstanding that our focus, like, we're supposed to be able to maintain like this high degree of intense focus on our thoughts and awareness on our thoughts. And that sounds like it would be great. It also sounds exhausting. So even if we're doing that, there becomes a point of exhaustion where that's not maintainable, and default thinking creeps in. And so let's not blame ourselves for the default thinking when it creeps in. And at the same time, here, this is how the principle does work. When the default thinking does creep in and we see the experience, it's not at all to blame ourselves. It's not at all to be, we're not at the mercy of, it's not a punishment, right? It is simply life mirroring back to us like a signal, like, hey, there was a moment when a default answer, a default thought crept in. This thought exists in our thinking and collective unconscious thinking, in our unconscious, in our biased whatever. Somewhere this thought crept in, and this is the experience of that. So if you are willing, if it feels right, if you have the energy to do so, maybe just explore, what might have been the thought that, was there something that happened recently where I lost focus, or was just focused on something else, or whatever. And it can be a very interesting experience to look at life as that mirror, gently, slowly, right? Without the frustration, right? I mean, I think it can easily be frustrating to, like, oh, did I do it again? Is this my fault, right? Like, we are in a very blamey and shamey kind of culture. Like our cultural culture has that tendency to kind of point fingers and shame and blame for things, and take the appropriate amount of responsibility. Bad word, right? Responsibility sounds like I have to take responsibility for the whole thing. It's like all of it or nothing. But there is that very sweet spot in the middle of appropriate. And appropriate responsibility for our thoughts just means recognizing that my thoughts are active in creating my experience. And so if something does show up, it is simply an opportunity to recognize, something happened. And with things like major diseases, this is a very gentle path to even go down, and maybe certainly not one to do on your own, to do with help, but it's a path maybe to look at gently and slowly, but certainly not one. It would be very easy to look down that path and start blaming, like, oh, I did something wrong. And that is not at all, A, not at all helpful, and B, not at all the intent of the teaching. And yet I think that's like the unspoken parts of the teaching so easily say that is, because of our cultural upbringing. The same thing with responsibility, right? That very easily is the assumption made then that, oh, I am responsible for this. I caused this. I created this. So here's the thing. We would never assume that a baby should take responsibility for any life-altering illness or disease. We just wouldn't. Now, they're not. I would hope. Please. I hope that none of us would ever, right? That no one would ever blame a baby for an illness, and yet at some point, right? But as adults, it's easy enough to blame ourselves for, especially in I've heard many stories of people not wanting to show up to Sunday services for communities that meet in person because they had a cold. And just even being recognized as having a cold, there's like this stigma of like, oh, what do you think? You thought, what's in your consciousness? You thought that wrong. But we would never, an infant gets a cold and we would never go, what did they think about, right? Part of that is because a child's consciousness is so directly tied into that of the parents. So there is this relationship and dependency, and ideally a healthy dependency between the child and parent. And so as that child grows older, at some point there is this emancipation, right? That the child goes off on their own, become free to develop and have their own awareness. And somewhere along the line, we are taught or shown or draw conclusions that we are somehow then either wholly responsible or not at all responsible. But the point is, we can't hold someone responsible. Well, maybe we shouldn't hold people responsible. Again, there's that healthy sweet spot of responsibility, right? You would not put responsibility on a child for something that they are not aware of. We probably shouldn't put that responsibility on an adult of something they're not aware of. So as long as we are unaware, there's no sense in tying causation to responsibility unless it is about how we are going to proceed, right? So we are not to blame for whatever scenario we find ourselves in. It is ours to take a look at, to observe, to be mindful of the decisions we're making from that place. And so is there an opportunity to change the scenario we're in? Yes, absolutely, but only when we're aware of it. And so just because we are aware of new thought principles does not mean we are 100% aware of all of the experiences we are in, of all of the thoughts we are having. And so it is a process. It is a journey that the mechanism in place that is life is we have a thought, we have beliefs, we have emotions and feelings and actions and values and principles. And what plays out in our life is the outpicturing of that, the sum total of all of that, plus our default awareness, right? So the mechanism is the mirror. It is not to point back at us and say, hey, you did this wrong. It is to direct us to the places where we are unaware. So through an abundance perspective, when we look at universal principles, abundance is a universal principle, and it will point us to all of the abundance in the world. I mean, from the air that we breathe to the space that exists around us. I mean, there is so much more than enough of everything when we observe universal principle, when we follow human need, right? When we collectively come together to meet all of our needs, we open up this valve, this flow of life, of abundance. And so simply the takeaway from this week, simply to start this flow of abundance, is to find the places where there is already abundance and act from those places. One of the easiest things is we are each, I would say, born with a gift. What is your gift to the world? What is the thing that is so uniquely you? And how can you give that gift away in abundance? We just give of ourselves that gift. That way we serve humanity without any attachments. It's just that thing that feels so good to give away. You would do it no matter what. Give of that, be of that space, and the abundance will flow because you are in that place of abundance, because abundance exists. We don't have to create abundance. We don't have to think differently for there to be things in abundance. It is a law. It is the activity. It already is. And so when we recognize that, when we find the space to be in that, when we act from that place, there's no choice but to be that, to see that, to have more of that. Abundance yields abundance. So if there's any takeaway for this week 1 of Not Yo Mama's Prosperity, Reimagining Abundance, find that thing that is your unique gift and see how you can give it away. And watch as abundance just flows through your life. Watch as abundance just shows you, demonstrates to you how that is just the natural way of the universe. Life exists in abundance. And I'm going to find the closing thing here in a second. That was definitely not it. Here it is.